Across the world, decisions are being made that will shape politics, security, and everyday life long after today's headlines fade. From diplomatic negotiations and military tensions to economic uncertainty and demographic change, these developments are unfolding simultaneously, often quietly, but with lasting consequences. This report brings together the most important significant global events of the moment, focusing on where power is shifting, what pressures are building, and why these issues matter beyond any single country or conflict. The deal that could redraw Europe inside Trump's high-risk Ukraine gambit. A major political gamble is unfolding behind closed doors, and its outcome could reshape Europe's security landscape for decades. According to senior US officials, negotiations to end the war in Ukraine are closer than at any point since the conflict began. Washington claims a deal is within reach, but Moscow is signaling that it will only agree if the framework changes drastically. This tension, optimism from the US side, rigidity from Russia, defines the current moment. At the center of this effort is President Donald Trump, who has taken a deeply personal and unconventional approach to diplomacy. Rather than relying on the traditional web of foreign policy institutions, Trump has pushed forward using a small circle of trusted figures, including longtime associate Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law Jared Kushner. Veteran diplomats and Ukraine specialists were largely sidelined during the early stages of the plan's creation. This style is intentional. Trump believes the established foreign policy system has failed repeatedly. Iraq, Afghanistan, and years of stalled Ukraine diplomacy are often cited by his team as proof. His view is simple: disrupt the process, force decisions quickly, and accept political risk in exchange for a potentially historic outcome. That strategy has already delivered one result Trump frequently points to: a ceasefire in Gaza that eluded previous administrations. The proposed Ukraine deal, largely shaped outside Washington, reportedly demanded sweeping concessions early on. These included limits on Ukraine's military capacity, restrictions on NATO ambitions, and territorial compromises favoring Russia. European leaders reacted with alarm, seeing the plan as dangerously loop-sided and potentially empowering Moscow for years to come. Inside the United States, the backlash has been just as sharp. Members of Trump's own party have accused him of abandoning the America First principle by becoming too deeply entangled in overseas conflicts. Polls show his approval rating slipping, driven mainly by economic concerns at home, a reminder that foreign diplomacy always carries domestic consequences. Meanwhile, Moscow has responded not with outright rejection, but with calculated pressure. Russia's leadership says a peace agreement is possible, but only if Washington makes what it describes as radical changes to its proposals. According to the Kremlin, the remaining obstacles center on two issues: territorial control in eastern Ukraine, particularly the Donbas region, and the future of Europe's largest nuclear power plant at Zaporizhia, which remains under Russian control. Russian officials refer to these as technical issues. Ukraine calls them existential threats. President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly warned that surrendering territory without a national referendum would violate Ukrainian law and open the door to future Russian advances. Despite this, talks continue, with both sides aware that the balance of power on the battlefield and exhaustion after years of war hangs over every discussion. While negotiations intensify, a striking development has emerged in parallel. For the first time since the Cold War, the Kremlin has publicly welcomed the US national security strategy. Moscow says Trump's newly signed doctrine largely aligns with Russia's own worldview, an extraordinary statement considering decades of rivalry. The strategy emphasizes flexible realism, a reduced focus on ideological expansion, and a rejection of the idea that NATO must endlessly grow eastward. Russian officials called these signals encouraging, especially language suggesting that strategic stability, rather than confrontation, should define relations between Washington and Moscow. This shift marks a profound change from previous US administrations, which consistently framed Russia as a primary destabilizing force. Instead, Trump's strategy places China at the center of long-term competition and warns against driving Moscow and Beijing closer together. Trump himself has publicly said that the greatest geopolitical mistake would be allowing Russia and China to form a unified bloc, a partnership already deepened by sanctions and energy realignment since the Ukraine war began. Still, skepticism remains high. Inside Washington, many officials reportedly learned about the Ukraine plan through media leaks rather than internal briefings. European allies remain unconvinced that speed should outweigh caution, and critics warn that concessions made under pressure could undermine European security for a generation. Supporters counter with a blunt argument. The war has produced staggering casualties, devastated economies, and brought Europe closer to direct confrontation with a nuclear power. From this perspective, disruption may be preferable to paralysis. What does a real end to the war look like? How much compromise is acceptable? And who decides where the new lines are drawn? The final outcome remains uncertain. What is clear is that the traditional rules of diplomacy are no longer being followed. One way or another, this moment may redefine not just the future of Ukraine, but the architecture of global power itself. One radar signal from war. China and Japan drift towards dangerous air confrontation. A brief flash on a military radar screen has pushed East Asia closer to a serious escalation. Japan says Chinese fighter jets deliberately aimed their radar systems at Japanese military aircraft during two encounters near the Okinawa island chain. A move Tokyo describes as reckless and highly dangerous. In modern aerial warfare, illuminating another aircraft with radar is widely understood as a pre-attack signal, often forcing pilots to prepare for evasive or defensive action. Japan's Prime Minister called the incidents unacceptable and beyond what is required for flight safety, confirming that official protests were lodged with Beijing. Japan's defense leadership stressed that while the response would remain calm, the country would not tolerate actions that threaten regional stability. China, however, rejected Japan's account outright. Beijing argued that Japanese aircraft has repeatedly approached Chinese naval forces during previously announced carrier-based drills east of the Miyako Strait. According to Chinese officials, it was Japan, not China, that endangered aviation safety by flying too close to active military operations. Chinese military spokespeople accused Tokyo of exaggeration and political manipulation, warning that China would take necessary measures to defend its interests. Regardless of which version is accepted, both sides agree on one thing. These were among the most serious military encounters between China and Japan in years. The incidents unfolded near disputed territories at a time when relations were already under strain. Tensions spiked recently after Japan signaled it could respond militarily if a Chinese move against Taiwan endangered Japanese security. That warning struck a nerve in Beijing, which considers Taiwan central to its long-term national vision. The geography makes this confrontation especially sensitive. Taiwan is located just 110 kilometers from Japan's westernmost islands, placing Japan directly within any potential conflict zone. Japan also hosts the largest concentration of US military forces overseas, including aircraft, warships, and thousands of Marines stationed in Okinawa. Australia has since weighed in, publicly supporting Japan and expressing deep concern over China's recent conduct. Canberra emphasized that it stands with Japan in defending a rules-based regional order, a message closely aligned with broader US alliance policy. Washington's response, however, has been unusually subdued. While the US ambassador in Tokyo voiced support for Japan through public statements, President Trump and senior US officials have remained largely silent in public. Behind the scenes, Trump reportedly urged Japan's leadership to avoid escalation during a recent phone call, following earlier talks with China's president, who reiterated that Taiwan's unification remains non-negotiable. At sea and in the air, China continues to increase its presence. Japanese officials say the jets involved were launched from China's Liaoning aircraft carrier, accompanied by missile destroyers operating south of Okinawan Islands. Japanese F-15 fighters were scrambled in response, a routine move that nonetheless underscores how quickly such encounters can escalate. This is not an isolated episode. Over the past decade, both sides have accused each other of radar targeting and dangerously close flybys. More recently, intelligence reports indicate China has deployed more than 100 naval and coast guard vessels across East Asian waters, a build-up Taiwan describes as a regional security threat. China insists its actions are defensive and lawful, even as it carries out drills near the Taiwan Strait, one of the world's most important trade routes, handling roughly half of global container traffic. The United States and Taiwan maintain that the strait is international waters. China claims exclusive authority. What makes this situation especially volatile is not just competing narratives, but timing. Military pressure, unresolved territorial claims, alliance obligations, and political signaling are all converging at once. Radar did not fire a missile this time, but in modern military doctrine, it is often the last step before one. Netanyahu rejects calls to step aside amid Israel and Gaza talks. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said he does not intend to leave politics even if he were to receive a presidential pardon in his ongoing corruption case, underlining his intention to remain in office amid legal and military developments. Netanyahu is facing charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust, which he denies. His legal team has argued that the trial process places significant demands on his time and that a pardon would help ensure continuity of governance during a period of national security pressure. Netanyahu's lawyers also maintain that the proceedings, if completed, would result in his acquittal. Last month, Netanyahu formally requested a pardon from President Isaac Herzog. Such a request is highly unusual, as president pardons in Israel are traditionally considered only after a conviction has been reached. There is no precedent in Israel for granting a pardon while a trial is still underway. Opposition figures responded by saying that any pardon should be accompanied by Netanyahu's withdrawal from political life or by the calling of early elections. Others have argued that elections, currently scheduled for late 2026, should proceed without interference from the legal process. The issue has also drawn attention internationally. US President Donald Trump communicated with President Herzog ahead of Netanyahu's request, encouraging him to consider the matter. The communication reflected Washington's continued engagement with Israel's leadership during an active conflict. Separately, Netanyahu is expected to hold discussions with Trump regarding the next phase of Israel operations in Gaza. These talks are anticipated to focus on military planning, diplomatic considerations, and broader regional stability. The overlap of legal proceedings, domestic political decisions, and military strategy has placed Israel's leadership under heightened scrutiny. At the same time, the United States remain a key participant through diplomatic support and coordination. As the situation develops, decisions taken in Jerusalem and Washington are likely to influence not only Israel's internal policy trajectory, but also the direction of Gaza conflict and wider Middle Eastern dynamics.